I was in a pretty good position because the government had still pegged me. I was getting money from them, and they were like, we need to see you now kind of in the pro league and doing well there, the Team Canada, to kind of see if we're, kind of want you to maybe come to the camps. And so I was like, okay. And so I actually came down to Southern California initially that summer, right after I graduated. I didn't even go to my graduation. I came down like a week after I finished my exams and was supposed to come down here to spend, 3 months just training the person I had been working with, doing my, what we call off-ice training. So all the weight and conditioning training that you do in the summer. Had moved to San Diego from Toronto, and I didn't want to find somebody new. So I was like, all right, let's come down. Let's train, let's give this everything I have and see what happens. But I was also thinking, okay, well, I need to do something while I'm, playing next year because I'm not in school anymore. And so I already made the decision to do a certification program for something called muscle activation techniques, which is helping with the biomechanics and injuries and stuff for athletes and other individuals. And so that was kind of in my mind. I was going to go do that when I came back in the fall. While I was down here, the professional women's league that I was supposed to go play in folded, like it shut down. And so I was like, oh, okay, like, well, what do I do? Do I go out west to Canada where there was still some teams and leagues and play there? Do I wait and see what happens kind of in the Toronto area or the northeastern area of like, is another league going to get formed? What's this going to kind of look like? And I think it gave me enough of a pause because I was just like full steam ahead at that point, to be like, I don't know if I actually do want this. Like, is this something I really want, or is this just because I've said this is what I've wanted forever, right? And so, being down in California, it's a great place, I think, to reflect. And I was so far away from Toronto, everybody knowing me as a hockey player. So I was kind of in this little bit of a bubble of like, nobody knows me. Everyone's just I'm just get to kind of figure myself out here for a couple months. And
the weather's not bad in San Diego either.
No, not bad either at all. So I was sitting here, I was like, oh, it's nice here. Like, there's no humidity. There's no, none of the stuff that I have to deal with. And so I was like, okay. I think like a month and a half, 2 months in, I was like, you know what, I think I'm going to retire. And, I called my dad. He was not happy because in his mind, as much as, academics were important, all this, he was like, what are you going to do? Like, you're stopping hockey and what are you going to do?
Welcome to the Transition Drill Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Pantiani. I appreciate you taking the time to watch. So let's get into this. You're from Canada.
I am, yeah, Toronto.
How long have you been in California?
It's like 15 years now, almost 15 years now. Yeah, it's been a long time.
Before we go to what brought you down here, so growing up, tell me about your family. What was life like as a young Kate?
As a young Kate, yeah. So I, coming from Toronto, I have an older brother and then a younger sister, and we lived right in the city. My dad was a lawyer. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. So very fortunate in that sense, where my mom was there, to take us to school, and if we forgot something, or pick us up from school if we were feeling sick. So that was great. And my family is very, very athletic. And having an older brother, right, I kind of just followed him around and did what he did. And so right from an early age, right, I got put on skates when I was 2 years old, was out there playing soccer, playing hoops. I think I got my first basketball net when I was like 3. And then we started getting into organized sports when I was probably about 6 years old. And so I got thrown into soccer, tennis, gymnastics, ice hockey. And so I got a nice kind of wide range of exposure to different sports. But there was something about ice hockey that I loved. And I think coming from Toronto,
nobody in Canada plays hockey. So where'd that come from?
Yeah, exactly. Nobody plays it. So like, where's this coming from? So it's kind of in your blood, and you get to see it. And I was fortunate. I got to go to some of the Leaf games, which is the NHL team in Toronto, growing up. And as I got into kind of my adolescent years, my one of my cousins was drafted by the Montreal Canadiens in the NHL, right? So you start to get to see these like really cool things that people in your family are doing and are all around hockey. And so I started to get pretty dedicated, but there was no real expectation for me. It was kind of this interesting thing where my brother played and he was a good player, but he wasn't a great player. So there was zero expectation for me coming up, and I started playing with the guys when I was 6 years old. And so they thought, oh, here's just a female, and she comes in, and I ended up actually doing really, really well. It wasn't without its struggles though. So I think I got cut from my first team when I was 8. And, at 8 years old, you're just like, okay. And
a very naive question. For girls in Canada, is playing hockey normal? I mean, do you see a lot of girls playing hockey? Because I'll equate it to the States. Kids grow up here for the most part, at least my era. Boys played baseball, girls played softball, and rarely did they ever cross. But obviously, hockey is just hockey. But was it common for girls to be drawn to hockey?
In the 80s, not so much. So I was growing up in the 80s. So I started playing organized when I was like late 80s. And so then women's hockey wasn't really a predominant thing. Like the first World Championships was in like 1990. Most females, if they were growing up at that time, were playing with the males. And that's why I started playing, with boys hockey. I did kind of do a year when I was like in grade 3, I think, with the females, but to give you context, it was like I was 9 and then I had like 13, 14-year-olds on my team because they're just the discrepancy, and there just wasn't enough females, and just the level was there was such a wide gap. So from the age of like 6 all the way through to high school, I was pretty much predominantly playing with the boys, and then hitting started to come into the play, body checking. And so I did 2 years of body checking, but when a 6-foot guy is coming at you and you're like 5'4" and wanting to put you through the boards, you're kind of like, I'm good. I think we're gonna kind of see what the female hockey is like at this point. And luckily it kind of caught up by that point where there was a lot more women playing. The organizations were starting to grow, and that was just becoming a more predominant for females to play. And so by the time I transitioned to just playing females, it was at a really good high caliber.
And was it still outside of the school realm that you were playing? Was it we call it here either rec or travel, that type stuff. Was it in that realm, or was it through school that you played?
Yeah, so for hockey in Canada, or at least in Toronto, it's generally like what we would consider out here the rec or club type of scene where you're playing outside of school. They definitely have, when you get into high school, there is some high school teams, but for me, it was like, that was the fun team. You go into high school, you play your high school team, and it's really, really fun. A lot of varying ranges of skill sets. You had people like me who were, aiming to go to college in the States on a scholarship, to those who were, just average or okay, or starting to, just beginners within the sport. And so that was just kind of about having fun when you played through school. The real serious stuff happened, kind of in that rec club scene where you're out there, you're trying out, and you're traveling around. For me, fortunately, Toronto's kind of the hotbed of hockey in North America. I guess Minnesota might argue that fact, but at least, for us in Canada and the Northeast United States, a lot of tournaments happened out of Toronto. So we actually didn't have to travel very far, but in and around Ontario and the Toronto area, that's where we kind of traveled.
So the travel aspect, even as a young kid and even into the 80s around hockey, was already starting to become the norm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And where was the farthest you got to travel as part of, before you went to college, say?
Montreal and Detroit. So they're about, both of them, either direction, about 4 or 5 hours away from Toronto. So that was pretty much the farthest I got to go. So it wasn't anything like super amazing, but in one sense, when you're playing, like where you go, you don't get to see where you go anyway. So in one sense, I think it was kind of nice where you don't have to go on a plane and travel super far. You just get in a car and you go drive.
Going backwards a little bit, you mentioned brother and a sister. Your brother played sports also, but your parents, were they very active with sports as kids growing up, or did they just kind of drive you guys to it in the sense of, let's give them the opportunity and see what they want to do?
No, they were both very active people. So my mom, her family especially, super active, big runners, big swimmers. My mom's dad at one point when I was growing up was like the head of water safety for the Red Cross in Canada. So they were huge. Like my mom's sister was very, very competitive in swimming. So swimming and running on that side of the family was, really big. And even when I was growing up, they were still, my grandpa was still running and still doing that kind of stuff. And then my dad, he played a little bit of football. He was just very, very passionate about hockey. Didn't go very far with it, but he grew up in Montreal. So was like a huge Montreal Canadiens fan. And so he was also athletic, and he did some running. And even now, he's in his mid-70s, he's still very active and in good shape for that age. So I did come from very athletic and kind of active parents, and so I think the athletic part was very, very important to them to just get us in there and get us active and kind of playing. And my sister she's also super athletic as well.
Now, with you, were you of the siblings? Did you go and I'll put it in air quotes, the furthest?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Did there ever become any type of rivalry, or were everybody pretty good with it?
No, I think both my siblings were really good with it. The one thing is that when we played, we had a rink in our backyard, and when we played that, I had to a lot of time get put in the net because they're like, we're not playing against you right now. You get put in the net. We're gonna shoot against you, not play against you. No, I think my brother was really good with it. He didn't, that wasn't his thing. He was good, but he broke his leg playing hockey, I think like grade 8. And so that slowed him down, and he then just became more kind of recreational and more liking to just be active versus being super competitive in something. My sister she did a year of, what we call university hockey up in Canada. And I think for her, maybe a little bit harder because she's 6 years younger than me. And so I had no expectations on me because my brother was, again, average.
But you were setting the bar pretty high for her.
Yeah, I was setting the bar very high for her, and she was coming a decent amount of time behind me. And I think, that I'm sure was very hard. I haven't had a full-on conversation with her about how hard that might have been on her, because I know even, when I had graduated from undergrad and played, and I had won all these awards and was recognized as the best for that level in Canada, she went to a different school and a different conference, and people would, ask her oh, are you Kate Allgood's sister? And I'm like, oh, that's probably not an easy thing to deal with.
No, I don't even know who she is.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know who that person is. So yeah, she had to deal with that. But I think the fortunate thing is we're very different in terms of our body type. And she's 5'9", 5'10", and so she's bigger, and I'm smaller. So I had to play a different game than she could play. But I think it was still probably, pretty hard, to kind of obviously, yes, come up under my shadow.
Was there a pivotal moment in your early career? Was it you that saw it, or did somebody else see it in you that drove the train further to hey, this is not just a passing fad?
I think it was both. I think I had high aspirations. My personality is very driven. I was the kid who'd be okay, I got to shoot 10 baskets in a row before I go inside, right? I had that personality type of when I got my head wrapped around something and wanting to be good with something, it was there. But my dad, I think, also saw it and pushed me and started putting me, private skating lessons, private shooting lessons. He started to, put that investment in those other components that you kind of have to start to put in if you want to be good. And that's not without its difficulties though, right? There were times when he was overly invested, and it became not the best relationship because it was I come off the ice and it was well, you did this and this wrong, and I'm did I do anything right? It starts to feel that pressure. And he changed with time because I told him he had to kind of stop, and fortunately he did. So there was a little bit of that was hard when I was about 12. I think that was really, really hard for me because it was there was so much pressure. And I was the kid who would slam her stick on the ice if I didn't score. That, just trying to deal with that. You don't know at that age how to deal with it. So it comes out in different ways. And for me, it was coming out just with anger, if I missed an opportunity or something like that on the ice. And then with time, as I said, it got easier. And so, yeah, I think it happened pretty young because when I was growing up, obviously, when I was 6 and naive, I was yes, let's go to the NHL. And then you obviously start to realize that's not a possibility. And so college hockey in the States was that goal for most female hockey players when I was growing up. It was kind of the best that you could get to until 98 when the first, women's were allowed in the Olympics for ice hockey. And so that obviously changed the focus. But that had been my goal from, a pretty young age. And, by the time I was 14, I was getting letters from Princeton and a lot of these other schools in the Northeast United States.
For a critique of Canada from a Canadian's perspective, why is the college scene in Canada not conducive to female hockey?
The money. It's not even just female hockey. It's sports in general, right? You didn't have the option for scholarships back then. And so that's a huge part. So when you have the money and you can put that into the dressing room, the equipment, the ice time, giving kids scholarships, right, who maybe otherwise couldn't afford it, that drives, a lot of really great athletes from Canada come down to the States if they can. And so I think that was the same with the men's hockey. It wasn't just a female hockey thing. It was the guys I had played with and grew up playing with, they were going to Brown and all these other schools in the Northeast United States as well.
So a very natural transition for a lot of young Canadian kids, students, to go to college in the States who are advanced in athletics.
Correct. Yeah. And it's slowly changed though, but still to this day, I would say if you're really, really good, generally you are still looking to go to the States. Yeah.
I want to touch on this real briefly because of what you said, and we're going to get into what you're doing today with sports psychology. But I think back to how sports have changed from when I was a kid to today, when my kids were younger and they were playing. And you brought up a good point of, I think all kids get frustrated when they're playing sports. But I wonder how much of it is compounded by parents who don't let them just be kids and just play the sport. And it's sad that there's actually signs out now that, at stadiums, they're just kids, just let them play. And so do you think any of that kind of drove you to where you're at today?
I think a little bit, yeah, because I think my personal experience and journey was a big influence on where I am today, right? In one, deciding to continue with the high performance world, and two, deciding to do more of the mental component versus the physical. And I started off actually working with athletes when I first stopped playing on the physical before I went back to school and got 2 master's degrees in psychology. But it definitely influenced me, right? Because I think it's just, parents do the best they can. They're trying their best. My dad was trying his best, right? But they don't know, really how to support their young athletic child. And so sometimes it just comes out in the wrong way.
Staying with the school age, Kate, your dad was a lawyer, correct? Was there ever did it ever come to that seesaw battle with, hey, at the end of the day, you're just playing hockey, academics is more important? Or did you enjoy academics? I guess what I'm getting at is, was there ever a point where academics got kind of put on the back burner?
No. So yeah, my dad being a lawyer and his family as a whole, very educated people, school was exceptionally important to both my parents. And so, again, very fortunately, I was able to be put in some of the best schools in the Toronto area. So, in grade 4, I went to a private school until grade 8, then went back to a public school for a couple of years, but then went back to a private school just when the public school system wasn't really working out. And it was, there's twofold for reasons why we went to a private school. One, obviously, the student teacher ratio, right, is smaller. But all three of us, so myself and my siblings, we all had, learning difficulties. And so I think we needed that extra support to help us. So for us, it was super important. We had to work really, really hard to get average grades. And so, my dad was the one sitting there drilling me on answers for a test or, trying to help me in that sense as well. And, I had, tutors for school as well. So no, there was never, school was never on the back burner. It was always extremely, extremely important to my parents as well. And especially, being a female hockey player at that time, right, there really was no opportunity to make it a career, to make money out of it. So you kind of knew you go and you're going to play and you can go pretty far, but you need to always have a little bit of this idea of what's after. And so I think that, was a part of, I didn't really like school at times because it was so hard, but yeah, we definitely got pushed and got put into some, great supportive systems to help us, do what we could with school.
Coming to the end of high school and heading into college. So then was your plan simply to use hockey as a means of going to college?
It was, I guess, in one sense, it wasn't a necessity. I knew I could go to school, either which way, from both a financial as well as an academic standpoint, because again, graduating from, the oldest private school in all of Canada, like you definitely have a leg up heading in. So it wasn't necessarily a question of I need this. It was definitely my goal. My goal was to go to school on a scholarship, just because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to play against the best. I wanted to, be in what was considered almost the most professional environment you could get put into, with the nice locker rooms and the support and all that kind of stuff that the pro guys get to kind of experience. And interestingly, I ended up taking 2 years off of competitive hockey when I was 18, 19. So I ended up going to school for a year of undergrad without actually playing ice hockey. So I took my last year of high school off, which for us in Ontario, I had a grade 13. So I took that year off, and then first year of undergrad, while I was dealing with some mental health stuff I had to deal with. And then I decided to go back. So I actually didn't end up initially going with hockey, and then ended up playing 4 years.
After playing for that long and going into the psychology aspect, did the break help you, or did not having hockey in your life kind of exacerbate the issues?
No, I think it helped, because I still was playing. It was just lower level. It was more getting back to the fun of it. And I think that's something that had happened where there was, yes, some mental health stuff I was dealing with, but there was a big burnout that happened for me. And so I think I had to kind of rediscover a little bit of that love for the game and get a little bit of a break. And some people would say, when you're 18, 19, and I wasn't necessarily in the prime of my career, but obviously right at that phase where you're supposed to go off to school. And that's when, Team Canada is going to start to be looking at you. That could have been obviously, some people would have said to your detriment, but, I ultimately made the best decision for me. And I didn't know if I was going to go back. Like, it wasn't when I stopped being like, all right, I'll just take a year or two off and then I'll go back. It was really in my first year of undergrad, I went to one of my former teammates' games. There was Niagara playing Mercyhurst. I, crossed the border to go over and watch. And I just sat there. I was like, no, I want this again. And then kind of started on that path to make that happen for me.
Did you initially go into that step back willingly, or was it kind of from outside influence, like, hey, you need to step back and kind of recenter yourself?
I think there was mainly me, but I think if I hadn't done it, there would have probably been a good chance somebody would have told me to take that step back. Yeah.
So in a weird way, it almost kind of sounds like maybe hockey had gotten to be a point of a negative in your life.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it definitely had become a negative, and a big part of that, that I realize now in retrospect, beyond some of the, family stuff I was dealing with, was just my identity was hockey, and that was all it was. And so when that's the case, it can definitely lead to a lot of burnout, because your identity is overly invested in this one singular thing. You don't know who you are outside of it. And then also a lot of my personality characteristics that were advantageous for me early on in my life, they do actually start to become some of those barriers, because you get a little bit of that obsessive personality, and that can sometimes lead to not necessarily the best choices or behaviors.
Well, and the other thing I would imagine too, life is about relationships. And I would imagine that when if your natural personality is somebody who's, I'm all in 100 miles an hour, 100%, you're probably going to push people away who don't have that same mentality. And so, like you mentioned, when you do eventually step away from it, you don't have a support circle because you haven't embraced bringing people into your life. Or am I overgeneralizing it?
For me, I don't know if I pushed people away. My teammates were definitely in one sense, the support system, and there definitely were people who were maybe less driven than I was. But I don't think that was necessarily the case. I think some of it for me maybe was the team I was playing on was a little bit further out. So those girls on my team weren't immediately close by. And I definitely, it wasn't the easiest for me just to make friends in general in school. I think just because I was the athletic one. And when you're a female and the athletic one at a younger age, you maybe get teased a little bit more. So there was a little bit of that. So I don't know if it was because I was so driven. I think there were some other things going on where it was just a little bit harder to have that and make that support system. Obviously, then again, though, my family was, that support system for me. And I was fortunate that, my grandparents were in the area. So there was, in one sense, from the family standpoint, that existed. But yeah, from the friend standpoint, there was definitely, not that support system.
That pivotal game when you went to see your friend play in Niagara and you're like, no, I need this back in my life. Yeah. Was your family supportive of you going back into it?
Yeah, I don't remember. Maybe they weren't, but I don't remember. Like, to me, it was like, as soon as I put my mind to something, it's like, okay, we're doing this, right? And it's, it's an interesting thing, because like, I could have sat there and been like, oh, like, I don't know, I've taken 2 years off, and like, who's going to want me? I didn't even think about those things. I was like, nope, this is what I'm going to do. What are the steps to do it? Let's go do this. Like, and I have no clue how this is going to work out, but I'm going to figure this out. And so I think they were, because I know my dad helped me reconnect. When I was in high school, we had this person, and he was kind of the liaison between us and the teams for schools, kind of talking and talking to the coaches and trying to line up the best, matches for all of us. And so we reached back out to him and said, hey, like, she's looking again, can you help kind of, maybe find somebody or find a team? And I started reaching out myself to teams, and I wasn't hearing back from anybody. And then fortunately, there was a school called Clarkson, and they were just starting their program, their women's program. And so they were still looking for some people for the team. And so, we got in contact with the coach, and he came out and watched me, and he offered me, a half a scholarship and said, you can come on out. And again, it's a interesting thing, because I remember having the meeting with him. It was very distinct. And he was like, I project you'll be about third or fourth line. And so in hockey, third or fourth line, you're kind of the checkers. You're not the stars. You get less ice time than the first or second line. And I remember walking out of his office and being like, nope, I'm going to be first line. And just like went into the summer, got my training schedule, and just like I went head first.
And where is this college at?
Clarkson's in Potsdam, New York. So it's about 30 minutes from the Canadian border, just below Ottawa.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what year is this that you're going into?
This would be the fall of 2003.
And when does the Olympics start getting on your radar? Or was it already on your radar?
I think it was a little bit, obviously, when I was in high school, because 1998, I was in that kind of period of time. And then when I took the break, it obviously went off my radar. And when I was coming back, it wasn't on my radar, because I was just like, I'm just getting back into playing. Like, I'm just here to have fun and enjoy playing, and getting to enjoy playing at a high level. I had no clue if they were even paying attention to me. And then I think it was towards the end of that year, and again, very distinct memory, it wasn't the best coaching style. I remember my coach walked in, and we had this horrible game at Northeastern. And he walked in and he said, for all you Canadians out there, the under 22 coach was here, and you guys all sucked. And I was like, great. Okay, thanks. That's nice. Thanks. I'm enjoying that. And that's when I think it clicked again, where I was like, okay, like, the scouts they're out there and they are watching. But I think it didn't really click until I actually transferred after that year. Unfortunately, the coach at that school was kind of verbally and physically abusive. And coming out of my 2 years off, dealing with some mental health stuff, that year was very difficult for me. My parents separated. My first grandparent passed away, and I just didn't feel the support was there to deal with all of that stuff.
Right.
And so I made that really, really hard decision, because that had been my goal for a long time, to go to the States on a scholarship, to transfer back to the original school I had gone to by Niagara Falls, called Brock University. And so I transferred back to go play hockey. And again, I think the same thing. I went back initially. I was like, I'm just here. I'm happy to play hockey. I don't care. But then I started to do actually very, very well, very quickly in that league. And then all of a sudden you start to get the attention of the scouts.
And what was your first significant memory of actually being contacted? Because it's got to be a huge deal for somebody to come to you and go, we want you to try out or give you an opportunity for our Olympic team. Because it was a developmental team, correct?
So the way that it works in Canada is they peg a few of us, and they say, okay, you're on our radar. At that time, because Vancouver had been given the 2010 Olympics, Canada was starting to pump more money into those of us who had been kind of selected as potential candidates. And so, I'd get money, and I remember my coach would say, hey, Wally, who was the head scout, he's coming to the game tomorrow, or he'd like to, maybe talk to you, or he'd send me emails. And so funny enough, didn't have a distinct memory for me, because I think it was a slow process where they were just starting to see and kind of feel it out and start to say, hey, like, you're within the ability to be selected to then go to the training camp. I never got to the training camp. I was just in that pool of, hey, we have our eyes on you, and we want to kind of see what you do here.
So when did hockey stop for you?
Hockey stopped for me after my last year of undergrad.
And what year was that?
So that was 2007.
And what was your plan at that point in time then for your future?
Yeah. So it didn't stop. It stopped suddenly in one sense as well. Like I actually hadn't planned to stop when I stopped. So I graduated and I was like, okay, what's next? And one, I was very much looking to 2010 because it was still 3 years off. And I was in a pretty good position because the government had still pegged me. I was getting money from them. And they were like, we need to see you now kind of in the pro league and doing well there, the Team Canada, to kind of see if we're, kind of want you to maybe come to the camps. And so I was like, okay. And so I actually came down to Southern California initially that summer, right after I graduated. I didn't even go to my graduation. I came down like a week after I finished my exams and was supposed to come down here to spend, 3 months just training the person I had been working with, doing my, what we call off-ice training. So all the weight and conditioning training that you do in the summer. Had moved to San Diego from Toronto and I didn't want to find somebody new. So I was like, all right, let's come down. Let's train, let's give this everything I have and see what happens. But I was also thinking, okay, well, I need to do something while I'm, playing next year because I'm not in school anymore. And so I already made the decision to do a certification program for something called muscle activation techniques, which is helping with the biomechanics and injuries and stuff for athletes and other individuals. And so that was kind of in my mind. I was going to go do that when I came back in the fall. While I was down here, the professional women's league that I was supposed to go play in folded, like it shut down. And so I was like, oh, okay, like, well, what do I do? Do I go out west to Canada where there was still some teams and leagues and play there? Do I wait and see what happens kind of in the Toronto area or the northeastern area of like, is another league going to get formed? What's this going to kind of look like? And I think it gave me enough of a pause because I was just like full steam ahead at that point. To be like, I don't know if I actually do want this. Like, is this something I really want, or is this just because I've said this is what I've wanted forever, right? And so, being down in California, it's a great place, I think, to reflect. And I was so far away from Toronto, everybody knowing me as a hockey player. So I was kind of in this little bit of a bubble of like, nobody knows me. Everyone's just I'm just get to kind of figure myself out here for a couple months. And
the weather's not bad in San Diego either.
No, not bad either at all. So I was sitting here, I was like, oh, it's nice here. Like there's no humidity. There's no, none of the stuff that I have to deal with. And so I was like, okay, I think like a month and a half, 2 months in, I was like, you know what, I think I'm going to retire. And, I called my dad. He was not happy because in his mind, as much as, academics were important, all this, he was like, what are you going to do? Like you're stopping hockey and what are you going to do to support yourself and all this stuff. And so, I kind of was traveling back and forth from Toronto that year. I was trying to figure stuff out. I had to figure out the visa and all that to move to the States. But yeah, I made that decision to stop. And as I said, I'd already made that decision to go and do that certification program. So I just focused on that for that next year while I kind of worked through, getting my visa and everything to come down here and live and work. And it all worked out about a year and a bit. I think it was a year and a bit later, I got my work visa to be able to move to San Diego.
And it wasn't hard for you to make that decision to step away from hockey, but yet still knew that you wanted to work with other athletes?
It was very hard. Like it was super, super hard. I tell this to, any athlete or any person who is doing something that they love and they're very good at doing. No matter when you make that transition, it's hard. I think there was good 3 or 4 years after I made that decision where I still had those moments of like, should I go back? I'm still young enough. I'm still like in shape. I could maybe go back and give this another go. Because when you hit those walls, when you're making those transitions, those things that are difficult, starting over, figuring out life, for me, figuring out life without hockey, who was I, without the game, and just starting a business from scratch and like all the obstacles that you face there, to have this thing that you're so good at, and it doesn't necessarily come easy, but so well. It was very much at times like, oh, like maybe just go back this way, right? And go play. So it was really, really hard. As I said, I think 3 or 4 years, it was a hard where my mind went to maybe I go back. And then after about the 4th year, I think I was like, okay, we're good.
Obviously one of the things with athletes is age is not a friend of being a competitive athlete. But in that 2-year break, did you, even looking back on it, did you notice a little drop off in your performance compared to the other people you were competing against?
Nope.
So when you were now down in San Diego, taking a little time away, you still didn't think like, oh, I haven't lost a step. I'm still good.
Yeah, no, I didn't think about that at all. Yeah, no, I thought I can come back. We're good. Like it would not be an issue. Yeah.
So when was the transition then to focus on academics and go towards sports psychology? What kind of drove that?
I think it was a little bit in the back of my mind. I had done some undergrad classes in sports psychology. So the mind had always fascinated me. The mind-body connection had always fascinated me. And so I think it's just I was done with formal education when I graduated from undergrad because, as I mentioned, I had to do grade 13, so that was 5 years of high school. I ended up doing 5 years of undergrad. So it was just a lot of like in that formal structure. And as I mentioned, because of the learning difficulties, school was not my friend. So it was just really hard. So I was like, you know what, I need to take a break. And I just hadn't seen anything that I really wanted. And so I went and I started, doing the muscle activation techniques and then started to explore, I think I got the itch about maybe 2 years after I graduated to be like, okay, I think I'm ready to go back. Let's do some formal education and further that. And so I actually, though, started off in Oriental medicine school. So I was going to school for acupuncture for about a year. Because again, the mind, body, and acupuncture is, fantastic and their philosophy of kind of that mind, body connection, energy connection. And while I was there, though, I was kind of like, I kind of like this, but I don't really know. And so I started to continue to explore like what other, sports psychology master's programs were out there. And eventually I found the right fit, and I found this program where I could do sports psychology as one master's, but I could also at the same time get a secondary master's in general psychology. And I ended up getting a concentration in family psychology just because when you're working with athletes, the family is a part of that equation. And so they allowed me to do both and to do both at the same time. I think they've now removed that option, but it was exactly what I was looking for. And so I dropped the Oriental medicine and then moved into doing those 2 master's degrees.
And prior to doing that, had you ever engaged personally with a sports psychologist?
Once as an athlete, so not much actual experience as an athlete with it, but I had talked to some people that I had known who were doing what I wanted to do to kind of understand what this looked like, what kind of path should I take based off of, what I was wanting to do. Do I just get my master's? Do I get a PhD? Do I go that direction? And so I had talked to a couple people in that sense, but no, I hadn't actually had too much exposure to it.
And I guess this comes from I've heard the term sports psychologist. Is that an umbrella terminology, or is it just being a sports psychologist one thing, or is there multiple things you can do as a sports psychologist?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The label and the terminology is actually very, very specific, and I think there's just a lack of education with what all these, terms in the field of psychology. There's a lot of different terms that people get placed under, and it's very specific based off of the legal requirements. And so in one sense, technically, a sports psychologist is someone who has their PhD in clinical psychology with a subspecialty in sports psychology, and they're the only people who actually can call themselves sports psychologists. So for me, as you know, it's like I'll use the term more mental performance mindset. So my master's degree in sports psychology allows me to do work with mindset, mental training, but that title sports psychologist is only designated to the clinical psychologist. And so for them, they're allowed to do the performance umbrella, but then they're able to do also the clinical umbrella. So dealing with eating disorders or anxiety, depression, drug addiction, anything that kind of would fall under that clinical area. Now, when we're looking at, the education behind sports psychology, it is called sports psychology, but it's not limited to just sports and to athletes. It's really, some people in some programs might call it more performance psychology, because it really is just about how to help people to perform at a high level. And so athletes generally are kind of one of those demographics that you look at that kind of relates to the mental game and trying to help them with their self-talk, their motivation, their confidence. But you can also then look at that with military, even business individuals, right? So it's really looking at high-performing individuals and helping them with what's going on between their 2 ears to help elevate their performance.
And that's obviously why we're talking today is how you've branched your performance aspect of it to then incorporate the first responder and military community. And for me, I was wondering, when was the first instance where you thought you could apply it, or that you actually applied it to a member of the military or a member of the first responder community, and what brought you two together?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think I knew going into this that while a lot of my work would be with athletes, it did not just pertain to them. And I think being in San Diego with such a high volume of military in the area.
There's one or two of them.
Yeah, exactly. I remember being contacted by a SEAL, and he was trying to make SEAL Team 6, and he was really struggling with the physical obstacle course that he was having to do as part of that, basically tryout. And so he had contacted me, and I already knew, I said myself, that it wasn't just specific to athletes. And so I think people in the military see, what athletes do, and they say, well, that's something I also need to do as well. And I do know, that the SEALs do have sports psychologists, or even people like myself with the master's degree who are working with the guys there. So it is available to them. And so when he contacted me, I said, absolutely, because it was a performance related component. It was him trying to physically get through something, and he wasn't, his mindset was not right. There was something that was blocking him to physically be able to do something that he should be able to do, because when he was doing it in his own kind of run through, he could do it. And then all of a sudden, when it came time to actually do it in pressure moment, he couldn't do it.
And at that point, were you already starting to try to market yourself or your the services that you offered to the military community, or did he come to you just by happenstance? I mean, like, did he happen to know somebody who was going to you? Were you actively trying to put yourself in that world to say, hey, I can also help? Because most people would think, oh, I play, hockey or soccer or something. That's what I'm going to come to you for.
I hadn't actively been putting myself out there. I think they said they understand that the principles that we do with the athletes translates to them. So I just was marketing myself, for athletes, but it has allowed, and a lot of people in the military or, some police officers I've worked with, to see that what they're needing comes from this, I said, performance kind of area of the mindset and mental performance. And so they just have kind of found me through, researching online and finding my company, Quantum Performance, and then seeing what I do and understanding that connection, that what athletes do is no different than what they need if it's in a performance relevant area.
So to boil it down to very basics, you've got a Navy SEAL who's trying to get past a specific obstacle to move on in his career. When he first comes to you, or when anybody first comes to you, well, I want to stay on that one. What ended up being his blockage, so to speak, that was preventing him from doing it? And was it a mental thing or a physical component?
Oh, no, it was purely mental. And one of the reasons why we knew that right from the get-go, as I mentioned, because he could physically do it when it wasn't test time, right? Because he could run himself through what he needed to do and execute it. And then all of a sudden the pressure's there and he couldn't execute it.
So when it was time for somebody to watch him do it, time him do it, he was failing.
Exactly.
So what did you do with him to get him through that roadblock, so to speak?
Yeah, so there's a number of things I do with athletes or the military. So in that instance with him, so I have everyone run through a performance assessment. It's called the Test of Attentional Interpersonal Style Inventory. And then so this allows me to get a snapshot of someone's mental strengths and areas of vulnerabilities, but very particularly it looks at and specifically what happens to someone under pressure and stress. Because that's really, when we're looking from the mental side, usually the biggest thing that throws things off from a mental perspective, it throws off your focus, your decision making, your confidence, your communication, these key components that you need to be able to perform at a high level. And so I kind of need to see, like, when that gets added to the equation, pressure, stress, that's beyond what you can tolerate at this moment, and that's part of what we have to work on. What starts to happen to these factors, so that how do we now get you to have either the routine or a particular mental skill that you're going to implement in that moment to help you?
So immediately in my head, what starts coming to mind is I think about, myself in the first responder community, but obviously, those in the military. It doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who's trying to go for an advanced position. I'll use my side of the house, like SWAT, something like that. What you're offering could also be just, and I don't want to use the word just, but for somebody operating in a day-to-day environment, but who is going to ultimately be in stressful situations, and how are they going to perform?
Exactly. Yep.
And from your experience, now that you've had time with it, is it always something where somebody's trying to advance to that next higher level that they're coming to you? Or what have been some of the instances where people from the first responder and military world have come to you?
A lot of it, definitely day-to-day stuff it helps with, but it definitely has been usually to advance to something. So from police, it's been going to SWAT, trying to go through that process and accomplish that. Navy SEALs are like Navy SEAL candidates, so they're going through the process to try and become Navy SEALs.
So they're going into the initial process? Or
they're already in it.
Okay.
Like they're actually in it. So they're either in first phase, second phase. So I've had individuals who are in first phase, like one person who was having trouble with the underwater test in terms of like holding your breath and like do the full length and back of the pool. And then I had another individual who's in second phase. And so a little different where all the physical stuff passed great. But now he was into kind of more the communication, having to present and do the leadership stuff. And he was having some struggles with that. So that too is a performance relevant thing of like, how do I stand up here and be confident and be open, but not too maybe forceful or not to like just stare at you, right? Like, how do you kind of do this? And then as I already mentioned, that other Navy SEAL, I did have a Marine fighter pilot. And I guess he was a little bit more day-to-day. He wasn't getting ready for something very, very specific. It was trying to help him in his training at Miramar, trying to help him to execute what he needed to do during the training phase he was going through, being stationed there to help him be able to execute what he needed to execute up in the plane.
So then I guess from a marketing perspective, if you could give that advice to somebody listening who is thinking that maybe they need some assistance, what are some of the things that they should be looking at that might want them to reach out to a performance coach? Or what might they be not noticing, if that makes sense?
I think it's always about, are you performing at your best? Like, do you feel like there's a gap between where you are and where you think you're capable of performing? That's usually a good starting place. Are you noticing that you're not doing as well as you probably could be, whether that's through your own training or practice and you're being able to execute something at a certain level. And then all of a sudden you get into that pressure moment or people are watching you, observing you, testing you. And now all of a sudden you're not able to do that. Or just on a day-to-day basis, do you feel like you're not reaching your highest potential in just day-to-day things that you're doing?
So coming to you could have nothing to do with physical performance. You may not work with somebody in any form of physical realm at all. It could be just working through mental issues.
Exactly. So obviously a lot of the stuff that I do, because usually a lot of high performers, there's some type of physical component to what they're doing. But as I mentioned, that one person who was going through second phase for SEAL training, it wasn't a physical thing. It was 100% just like debriefing, which is very, mental, but it a lot of the time it will be a physical thing that maybe you're seeing. But yeah, if you're not doing something physical, then it's just thinking about performance, doing presentations, meetings, doing calls. So I've worked with some people in the sales industry for business, right? And just like, how are you able to deal with the failure? How are you able to deal with the pressure of making that sale? How do you stay in the flow of having that conversation? So those kind of things. And for them, obviously, that's not a physical performance in that sense.
What do you find for most people is from the unable to perform aspect? Is it long-standing, like something happened as a child, or is it kind of something that just builds as we get older? I mean, is there any one thing that you've seen?
I don't dig too much into the past. I leave that for the clinical psychologists. So I do think it's usually, though, it's been around for a while. Usually, unfortunately, people get motivated to maybe do something about it when it gets bad enough, versus when it was, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and they were just starting to notice it a little bit. And so, I think for a lot of it also is the situation. Maybe they haven't been put in a situation where it got blown up big enough to really do something about it, right? Or to, like, as I said, the SEALs or the SEALs candidates I've worked with, right, up until that point, maybe never motivated, never needed to see someone, whatever was causing them now to maybe have a little bit of an issue, in that moment. Whatever situations they've been put in prior to that, it never, I guess, exposed maybe that vulnerability within them. And right, so now they're in this situation where it's getting exposed and now they need a little bit of help.
And for somebody who comes to you, I'll go back to the candidate who was just trying to make it to Team 6 and get past even for a SEAL, a more advanced obstacle course probably. That sounds like a one-off incident, but do you have clients or customers that once they're working with you, they'll kind of be working with you long-term? Or do you find that for most people, it's just getting them over that initial hump and then they know how to transition going forward?
Both, but everyone who starts off working with me anyways, usually is at least going to be with me for 2 months. And that's part of my process. And because nothing usually happens quickly. So even the individuals who are, I guess, trying to go through something like SWAT or going through the SEAL training, I think it's just important to have them for a while to help them. So for example, one of the individuals I was working with who was going through the process for SEALs didn't make it. And so there was a transition period and we were still working together. And I think he'd even gone past the initial 8 weeks with me. And that's something, some of them often do. And so we were then helping him with that transition of, okay, like what's next for you? How do you process this first, that you didn't make it? And that's hard because your goal has to be 100% your focus on making it. There can be no thought of what happens if I don't, right? Because if you probably do in that instance, then you're probably not going to make it. So now you're having to look at how do you process that, let go of the emotions and everything so you can now refocus on what's next. And so we then started to look at, okay, what's next? And so we took a lot of the stuff we had worked on initially to help get him through, or some of the testing through the process to help him understand what was going to be next for him. And he had to make those decisions of what did he do in this situation, which I think all potential SEALs candidates go through when they get dropped. And so he had already made a decision of where he was going to go. And so we started working on how do we help you perform in now that environment, which is going to be a very different environment than what we had initially started with. And so looking at the assessment that he had gone through, right? So we relooked at that and we started to use that to help him start to dial in. And interestingly enough for him too, in the new environment, it was going to be presentation stuff. That was something he really needed to work on. He was, as all these guys are, super confident, but sometimes he could come across maybe a little bit not in the right way. And so we had to help kind of, maybe soften his approach a little bit, just make it a little bit more open. Because if he's going to be a leader, which, as an officer you are, you have to be able to, yes, be confident and strong as you're presenting, but there has to be an openness there too. And it has to be, there's an art form with being a leader and presenting that we kind of looked at to help him.
Do you find that a lot of people who come to you for one issue, whatever it be, get past the obstacle course, that when they start working with you, they start identifying other aspects of their life that they're struggling to deal with or get past?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I think when someone comes, they have a very specific thing that they're trying to get through or overcome or deal with. And as we're going through things, and this is one of the things I love about the assessment I have everyone take, is because I can see before they maybe tell me what are some things that might be going on. And so it allows me to open up conversations and say, hey, like this assessment, told me blank about you in certain situations or pressure moments. Have you ever noticed that? And then all of a sudden it might be like, oh yeah, like this happens or that happens. And then that we can go down that and dig a little bit deeper.
If you don't want to answer this, I understand. Have there ever been, or do you have kind of your parameters of somebody you won't work with, maybe after doing that initial assessment, or at some point in time, you just kind of go, no, this is not going to work. And what might that be?
There's, I guess, two things there. One, if they have a clinical thing that I think potentially, like if it's deeper than performance, then, I refer them out. And number two, if they're just not committed to improving, that's really the biggest thing, right? For me, I've worked with so many different types of, high performers at different ages and different, sports or positions in the military. And it's always for me, are you invested in your own self-development? Do you come in here curious and wanting to discuss and have things you want to bring up and learn about yourself? And if you're not that person, if you're, sitting across from me, arms crossed, and just give me one word answers, then no. Then I don't. That
doesn't say open and inviting to you.
Yeah, exactly. And so then I'm like, no, we're going down that path. But I think for me, at least those working in, in the military, and first responders, they've all been very, very open. And I think part of it is this is their livelihood. This is something they really want to get good at. They're the ones, footing the bill themselves. And so when that happens, it changes your mindset. You're invested now in doing this process. And they're, at a stage in their life where they're like, you know what, I need to do something about this. And I'm ready to do something about this.
So I want to transition now into you being an author. For those watching on YouTube, your current book is on display.
Yeah.
The Athlete Within just came out this year.
Yeah, it came out like 2.5 months ago.
But this is not your first book. This is actually your third book.
It is, yeah.
Talk to me about what was the catalyst to want to write a book?
Yeah, so
at least maybe the first time.
Yeah, so the very first one, I think I've always been better at the written word than maybe the spoken word, and I think that was just through growing up, I was a little more shy and a little bit harder. I think part of it too was the learning difficulty. It was hard to find the right words to speak. So I was never I was never the outspoken leader. I was the lead by example type of leader. And so, I was sitting there and I think it was kind of an idea I had, like, let's write a book. And definitely when I was, going through it, to have something to, when you go to, do presentations, I think that was a big part of it, to have something, but also just maybe a little bit of a lower price point for people as well. I think it was also really important for a good introductory, right? Like someone can read that book, a little bit of an idea of my philosophy, my approach, who I am, which is an important part to then, if they maybe make that choice to then work with me. And I thought I could share, some at that point for the first one, some real good fundamental aspects of mental performance that were going to help some people. And then from there, I think it just grew. You get more ideas, you want to share more, you understand more. And definitely with this third one, a big part is, and I say it in the book too, it's what I understand at this point in my journey. Give me another 5-10 years and I'm sure I'll look at it and be like, oh man, I gotta redo all of that. And this has changed, because obviously things are changing. Science is changing. What we know about mental performance is constantly changing. But this book is really, for me, it was a deeper dive into helping not just athletes, but military. And I have a lot of, military examples in this book, as well as athletic examples of what it takes to perform at a high level when you're a little bit, I don't want to say older, but you've gone past that, the basic fundamental parts of, like, you understand imagery, you understand self-talk, but like what's next? And so this book is really, I broke it up into 3 different segments or parts that really, for me, I feel are really big umbrellas. And obviously then underneath it are different chapters. But one is, for me, I think from a performance perspective, knowing yourself, and that self-awareness is absolutely, it's huge. It's massive. You have to understand yourself. You have to understand what happens to you. So a big thing, going back to like what I mentioned with the assessment and these individuals who take it that I work with, a big part of it is you have to understand yourself and what happens to you when you go into certain situations, so that you can then make the choice of what mental skill, tool, technique can I implement here. And something a lot of people maybe don't always think about when we look at mental performance is our strengths often become our vulnerabilities if we overuse them. It's not so much that we have a gap in something, and sometimes obviously that is the case, but if you're, let's say, a really analytical thinker, which has happened for a couple of these military individuals I've worked with, and they're fantastic at they're fantastic at looking at life like a game of chess and seeing things, which if you're a leader in the military, an officer, that's really important skill set. But if you start to now overanalyze or analyze in the wrong moment when you're supposed to more be in action mode or just debriefing, you're going to get caught up and you're not going to perform at your highest level. So really understanding these different components of you so that you can then do something about it when you go in these different situations. So that's one component of knowing yourself. But then another one, and this goes into transitions as well, is know yourself beyond what you do and understand that this thing that you are doing is something you are doing, but it's not who you are. And I think too often, athletic or military wise, we become defined by the thing that we are doing. And with that, the transition becomes exponentially harder. It's already going to be hard. but it becomes way harder because you don't know who you are when you're now walking away from this thing that has defined you for years, decades, potentially. And so to really, look at who are you beyond this thing you're doing, and to do that proactively. Like, can you actually start to do that when you're the athlete or still active in the military, to start to look at different layers of whether it's, look at different hobbies or different things or interests that are going to be there for you when you retire, using this journey that you're on right now, or this phase you're in. How does it developing you as a whole person? And really being specific about that, and really thinking about that and looking at that and saying, how am I utilizing this time to develop myself beyond this time? And then that's going to carry forward with me. And then also understanding that no matter anything that you do, it is just something you're doing, and who really are you beyond any of the things that you're doing? They're just hats in one sense that you're putting on for a period of time. And at some point you're going to take that hat off, and you got to figure, that without that hat, you're still okay. And you know who you are, and you're still a whole person. And so I think that's also really, really important. And then another thing I look at in the book is, or one of the parts is choose your own way. So that ability to choose how you respond. And I think it's really important because military athletics are very structured in environments. We don't always agree with the structure or what's going on within them. And it's really like, how do you find the freedom to make your choices? And you always have the freedom to choose how you want to respond. That's literally, your attitude is like one of the most controllable components. And how do you use that to really find your own way in those, maybe situations or environments that maybe are not ideal for you? And I think, you're in it long enough, that's going to happen. You're going to have a boss, an officer, whatever it is, a deployment in sports, a coach, right? It's not going to be the most ideal situation. How do you find that ability to maintain your own freedom, your choices, and then also to figure out like what's the purpose beyond the external factors, which is also, I think, something that helps us with those transition periods as well. As we have these points and goals and purposes from the external factors of things we're doing. I don't know, win a championships or do something within the military, but like what's beneath that? Like, what makes this purposeful if those things maybe did not happen, so that, if they do not happen, and also when you're done with it, there's still something that you're holding on to that's purposeful for you, right? Which is really, really important. And then finally, I go into kind of the last part is presence, which is all about attention and flow and using your energy to really, what we all want to do. And when we're performing at a really high level is be in that flow state. And how do we do that? And a big part that we don't realize is our attention is a huge component of not only the flow state, but just our quality of life, and our ability to, to get satisfaction and purpose and meaning out of everything that we're doing.
When you said it earlier, talking about your hockey journey and how you mentioned as a young hockey player, you didn't deal with frustrations well, throw your stick on the ground, that type stuff. And you even made the comment back then that hockey was kind of your bubble. That's all you did in your life. And in my mind, I was already thinking about one of the biggest issues that we deal with, first responder, military members, is we make that our entire identity, our entire life. And when that's taken away, it has sometimes a very negative impact on us. And even before it's taken away, because we put so much emphasis into that lifestyle, the rest of our life suffers, or the rest of our lives suffer. Because you could relate to that, as part of your teaching style, is part of your performance coaching about building the outside person as well as focusing on what they've come to you to address?
Absolutely. No, it's a big part, because exactly like what you just said, it's not only if we're looking at that, what we're doing, it defines us. One, yes, it's not good for that transition, but even in that moment, it's not good. It puts extra pressure on us, or we're not our best selves when we're doing whatever we're doing in that period of time. And so we have to say, like, who are you away from it? And so my thing is, it's a very holistic approach that I take. It's really about the person and helping to develop the person, whether it's something very specific within, trying to get through SEALs training, or doing something within athletics. In essence, we're using that as the vehicle to help develop something within them and to help them understand themselves, but also to understand that this is just something you're doing, and you can actually become more free and perform at a high level, and even a higher level than maybe you think, when you let go of this thing that is defining you and just realize it's something I'm doing and I can put a ton of time into it, have a lot of heart, love it, a lot of passion, but it's not who you are. And that really can become, when you make that shift, just for you to go out there. And so like for athletes, I always say, just go out there and play, right? Versus, oh my goodness, I got to perform here. And if I don't perform here, then this is going to happen. And then that's going to happen. It's like, no, just go out there and just like enjoy it, have fun. Right. And that ultimately allows you to perform at a higher level.
Have you ever been the hardest voice of reason? And when I say the hardest voice, somebody coming to you, I want to be a Navy SEAL, I want to be a professional hockey player, and having to have that sit down and just go, you may have all the want, you don't have the ability, or you're not going to achieve that goal?
I've had some conversations close to that. Yeah. Where I'm honest with them and I say, okay, like this is great. I'm going to be honest with you. This is going to be maybe a challenging path for you. This is here are your strengths, and here's what this line, or this journey you're looking to go on is going to require of you. And so again, I never say you can't do it, because I think we can do whatever, a lot of people, what you put your mind to. But I say, if you want to do this, this is what you're going to have to do. And are you willing to put in that work? So for example, like training attention. From a performance perspective, attention is imperative. Most people do not formally train it. And if you do not train it, you will not perform the way that you need to. And I always tell people one of the best ways to train your attention is through mindfulness, is through meditation. And so if you're not willing to sit there for 5 minutes a day to meditate, but you're willing to, especially for the younger generation, scroll through social media for 20 minutes, that's your choice. And your choice is basically saying that you actually don't want the thing you said you just wanted. And so I have had those conversations with people eventually, of sitting there and giving them a little bit of that hard truth of saying, your actions and your choices are saying opposite of what you're telling me.
I guess where I was coming from is the person who is 100% focused, but maybe, if this is a weird question, could you see something in somebody where they're too focused on it? And like, you're going down this path, but maybe getting this goal isn't what's best for you as an entire person. Does that kind of make sense?
That just makes sense. Yeah. I don't think I've ever had that conversation proactively of saying like, hey, given where you're wanting to go, this may not be the best thing for you. I think there's always that potential. Obviously, if it's looking like it's an unhealthy relationship and that relationship with this, whatever they're doing is not healthy for them as a person, that's definitely, a possibility. I think I've had it retroactively, like afterwards. So the SEAL who wanted to become or the former SEAL, I should say, he wasn't a SEAL, but the person who was going through the process, and that was what he wanted and like really, really wanted it. Right. When it was done, we had more of that kind of a conversation of like, that actually might have been a blessing for you, because I think that wasn't going to be the best path for you, given your strengths, given what I know about you. And when he made the choice of what he was going to do next, like for me, when I looked at it, I was like, that's a much better fit for you. And so, yeah, I've had it more in that sense of saying like, hey, I think that was, actually a good thing, and trying to maybe use it as that way when something didn't work out, of saying like, that was okay, because I think we can get so focused of saying like, this is it. Like, this is what I want. And as you had said, we don't know, but sometimes it isn't the best thing for us, and maybe something is better. But no, I don't think I've actually sat there with somebody beforehand and been like, no, you don't want to do that.
But at least taking the opportunity when it, and I don't want to say they didn't succeed. They didn't achieve what they wanted to achieve, or at least they thought what they wanted to achieve. But then being able to step back and say, okay, let's look at the bigger picture, and how is this going to benefit your life? You thought you may have wanted this, but maybe this isn't what life is meant for you.
Exactly. No, I've had that conversation, and I was still in communication with him and still working with that individual when he did make the transition and moved up to the East Coast and continued on his path in the military. And I remember having the conversation, he was much happier. I think he finally clicked where he's like, this is much more of what I'm looking for. And it wasn't actually just even within his career. It was going to give him more of the lifestyle that he wanted of getting married and not being all over the world and not being home for, his wife and eventually maybe kids. He started to see that bigger picture that for him and what he actually wanted in life, as well as a career, that was both from a career perspective, much better fit, but even bigger picture, an even better fit for him.
You mentioned previously working with and addressing it in your book of, as you're starting to transition out, it's important to know yourself and kind of understand that you have an identity beyond the uniform. Mm-hmm. Have you worked with anybody making the transition out and helping them transition to that next phase in life from the military or the first responder community?
Mm-hmm. I've worked with a couple of people, and, a big thing is, it depends on where they're coming from. Some people have already started to have that thought process before, right? They're making that transition. And so that's one thing, which is great. It's something I advise everyone, right? Like, start to think about those next steps before you're...
Hey, that's my podcast.
Making those next steps, right? Focus on that, because it's an important thing to kind of have some type of idea of what you want to do when you're now making that transition. Because especially coming from the military, you're coming from an exceptionally structured environment, and sometimes now you're coming out of it and there's like no structure, and that itself is just, that's really hard to handle. Like, what do you do? Where do you go? So you need to have something that, like, what kind of idea, and it could be, I've seen so many different things. It can be from obviously starting your own business or entrepreneurship to going and working within a sports team. So a lot of actually ex-Navy SEALs do end up going and working within sports teams to help with the leadership and culture and the things that they're really good at. I've even seen one person who just loved golf. So he's like, I'm going to go try and become a pro golfer. I'm like, great. Like, that's giving you something to go do, wake up, have purpose, and go do it. Right. And he'd already, started to think about that prior to making that transition. But then when you're coming out of it, it's one is like, what are you trying to do? And then there's also just trying to, work through those sticking points as you're coming out of it, similar to like when I came out of being an athlete. Like, there's always maybe that little bit of that voice in your head. And again, I'm talking more from, somebody who's in one sense, coming out from a healthy perspective. I know obviously some people from the military will come out and maybe need more either clinical or medical help as they're transitioning out. So I'm looking more from the perspective of someone's come out and in one sense they're healthy, and this is more of just a normal transition kind of period. And just, as you said, like helping them to focus on like what is next, and to start to see that they can become just as good at this next thing as they were maybe within the job that they were doing within the military. Because I think sometimes that's the hard thing, is like, you were good and you did this for so many years. It was your identity. So if it is still part of your identity, how do we uncouple that a little bit and look at like, you are a person. You're now going to go into something new, and you're going to be able to be just as good, and to realize like what made you good in the military can make you now good in this next thing. The same characteristics kind of goes to what I said before, like how are you developing yourself as a person through your journey in the military is going to help you now in your journey after the military.
And for most of us, if the transition happens on our timeline, mm-hmm. I'll use you as an example. Your hockey career kind of came to an end before you really wanted it to. And for a lot of us in the military and first responder communities, if our career comes to an end before we thought it should come to an end, injury, something else, like you said, if you haven't already been thinking about who am I and what am I going to be outside of this world, that just makes that transition so much more difficult to deal with. Massive. Like it's huge, right? And that's why you have to proactively do it, because you don't know, as you said, like it could end in a moment. Like you generally, you don't know. In a good scenario, you get to make that choice, and you've thought it out, and you've done maybe 20 years in the military, and you're like, all right, I'm going to retire at 20 years and we're going to move on. And you start to kind of think about it. But if it happens and it ends tomorrow, like, are you ready for it really? Right. And if you're not, it's just, it's so hard. Right. And so you have to really think about, what do I want to do, or what could that look like afterwards? And really start to think about that. Did COVID impact your business?
More so just from a perspective of going to video and doing more things video. There was definitely, I think with all business, a little bit of a moment of a slowdown when things were kind of getting worked out. People weren't sure, for me, because I work mainly with athletes, were there sports going on, not sports going on. Obviously, sports were one of the first things that kind of did come back, especially in California, because a lot of them are outdoors. So they were able to do that, or they went off to Arizona and played where they could go play. And so in one sense, no, it didn't greatly impact me other than going to virtual.
And that was my follow-up question to that is, prior to COVID, were you always an in-person coach, or did COVID force you to embrace virtual, and now you kind of like, well, wait a minute, you embrace virtual?
So I actually, before COVID, I was already embracing virtual. I was trying to slowly educate clients that we can do some video sessions. They're just as effective. I also did have some clients outside of San Diego. So by virtue of that, we had to do virtual. And then COVID kind of fast tracked that. So in one sense, I was like, okay, great. So now people are into virtual. And then now as things have, kind of come out of it, I do a mixture where some people are over the whole Zoom and virtual, and they want in-person contact, and that's great. So they come to my office in San Diego, or if they're, for some people it's just more efficient, right? Instead of traveling and dealing with traffic that's now back, we just jump on a call and now we spend 45, 60 minutes talking. Or if they're not in San Diego, then obviously virtual is kind of the way we go.
But ultimately, if somebody is not in San Diego, you still have the ability to offer your services to them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I've worked with clients on the East Coast of the U.S., up in Canada. I've had clients in Australia and over in Europe as well.
Have you had the opportunity to be brought in at an organizational level and work with an entire entity as opposed to just one person?
I have, yeah. So I spent 4 years as the consultant for the San Diego Gulls, which is the local pro hockey team. Yeah, hockey team. Yeah, who are the primary minor league affiliate for the Anaheim Ducks. So I spent 4 years with them, getting to go in and work with the team as well as the individual players. Very fortunate. Part of that, we got some connections into the military as well, which was fantastic. But yeah, no, I got to work with them for 4 years, which was a lot of fun for me. Obviously, given my background in hockey, that was extra special. But yeah, that was it's fun to be a part of a team. Like, I enjoy my individual work because I kind of get to do what I want to do in one sense in terms of how I structure and do the programming and everything. But to be a part of a team again was fun, right? To be able to help a whole team accomplish a goal was a lot of fun. In 2019, we got to go to the conference final, and so that was a lot of fun to kind of go deep into the playoffs and experience that. So yeah, that was a lot of fun.
For you going forward, what are your long-term goals, or what are your short, like kind of immediate future goals?
Immediate future goals is so that this book and how I structured it, I think it's gonna revamp kind of how I look at to do things within my business and programming. And so that's kind of, in one sense, immediate short term is to really start to revamp how I may be approaching and the structure I have of my programs and how I look to work with people. I think it's not going to change significantly in one sense because my work is what informed this book. But I think in terms of being able to say, hey, like, this is what we're going to do, and this falls under, knowing yourself, and here's the purpose behind that, and this is why we're doing it. Also, like during COVID, one of the things I did is I kind of put together a bit of a video library, kind of video course, and it gets coupled with my one-on-one coaching for some. Some people just do my one-on-one coaching, but some do that, and I want to revamp that. And the way the world works now, I think being able to do really have a video library for people that are kind of composed of video shorts, because I think that's the big thing, right? Under 60 seconds these days, our attention span is very short. Is helpful because, again, it's just, we need to hear things multiple times. We need to pay attention to things because the way our attention works, we usually only pick up about 50% of what we actually, hear or what's in our environment. And so we need to hear things multiple times. And so I want to kind of revamp that video library. So I'll have to do a bunch of recording for that. I'd like to at some point get back into working with a team, and there are some balls rolling in that direction right now for that. And eventually, I mean, big picture, long term, I'd love to kind of get to a place where maybe I'm doing more like retreat-like kind of 3-day intensive type of stuff. Probably a lot of it will be focused on, the structure of the book, and, each day might be a section of the book and dive deep into those different things. So that's kind of where my goals are and where I'm heading.
You mentioned video library. So you have a YouTube channel, and I know you have some videos up there. That's a separate, or when you talk about a video library, that's something separate that you've done?
It is separate. Yeah, something separate that I've done. So yeah, there is the YouTube channel, and then I also do Instagram, as probably YouTube and Instagram are my two social channels that I really focus on. And so they have videos up there. And so the video library I've created is a little bit more, I don't want to say specific, because the stuff I'm doing on there is very specific as well, but it's structured just a little bit different, because the focus of YouTube is more of educational and just like, here's a brief thing. This is for someone who's probably working with me, so maybe it's a little bit more in depth, or we're giving them a little bit more, stepping stones, right? Because it's now being paid for. So it's a little bit different in that sense, where YouTube's obviously free. And so it's a little bit more of like, hey, here's an introduction, or here's a topic that we're going to talk about, pre-game routines or something. Here are some steps you can take. Whereas, if I was to do that for a video library, I'd probably get very like in depth into what does that look like.
Yeah, because that was one of the things I was going to comment on, is for somebody who wants to go watch even on an initial jump, to jump into working with you, the YouTube videos aren't very long, but it's still long enough to kind of give them an overview of you and kind of your mindset on bringing them to your philosophy, your coaching style, your performance style, and getting your mindset right.
Exactly. Yeah. No. So they're not super long. I purposely try to keep them, probably under 5 minutes, the YouTube ones, definitely. And then if you really need really short ones, go to Instagram. They're under 60 seconds. They're like really to the point, snappy, and there you go. So, but yeah, so they're great. Again, that's what I do want to try and be able to provide people with options to learn and to grow if they can't, work with me one-on-one. And that's, big reason for the YouTube channel, big reason for the books as well, is it provides that opportunity for people to get a little bit of what I can maybe help them with and teach them. And, eventually maybe it is something where if they get into position, they won't really want to, and they really want to take that and dive further in, then they can come and work with me personally. Most important,
do you still get time on the ice?
I do. I play once a week. I play in a men's hockey league in San Diego at UTC. So, yeah.
Does it feed you enough?
It does. Yeah. It's an interesting thing and I've watched this interestingly with a lot of people I know who were very, very high level hockey players growing up, where we're a little bit more like once a week type of people now in our, I guess, post competitive days. And then I see some people who weren't super competitive. They're out there like five times a week. And I'm like, no, I spent so much time at the rink, and that was my whole life for such a long time. So now I'm kind of like, no, like getting out there and playing. And the interesting thing is that it's all about the mind. Like if I'm in a good place and I get myself into like a flow state, it's all there. It's all still there. And so that's fun. And it gives me opportunity to go do other things, go golf or go paddleboarding or other, just go to the gym or go swim. So yeah, for me, it does fill me enough.
Very cool. You mentioned your company once before, but as we start wrapping this up, please mention your company and where's the best place to find, website. I know you mentioned Instagram and Facebook or YouTube. What are the face pages? Or the
handles?
The handles.
So my company name is Quantum Performance. And then for YouTube, you can find it under Quantum Performance. For Instagram, the handle is QP, as in Quantum Performance, and then athlete. And then that's my web address as well. It's qpathlete.com.
And I'll put all of that stuff in the show notes also. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I appreciate you watching. But before you go, if you like the video, please hit that subscribe button. Also, any comments are appreciated. Thank you.